Hello and welcome. This presentation will be about the Mantaq al-Tayr, otherwise known as the Conference of the Birds, by Farid ad-Din Attar. Farid ad-Din Attar was born in the 12th century in northeastern Iran in the city of Nishapur. His name, Attar, lends to us that he was likely a perfume seller by trade. However, since he wrote that he composed his poems in his Darul Khane, which in modern Persian refers to a chemist shop, but could also mean a dispensary or doctor's office, he may have well been a doctor for all we know. We might assume he was a Sufi just based on the mysticism and spirituality found in his works, but there's no concrete evidence for this. No one can point to a teacher, mentor, or even a specific Sufi creed that he followed, and for all we know, he was Orthodox Sunni, given the way he spoke about the Sahaba in some of his work. There are, however, traditions suggesting that he was taught the Sufi way by the spirit of Mansur al-Hallaj, another famous Sufi who was executed 2 centuries prior and was famously known for saying, Ana al-Haq, or I am the truth, which of course Orthodox Muslims at the time considered blasphemous. In terms of other influences on the Conference of the Birds, we could look at 2 works. One, which was similarly titled The Recital of the Bird by Avicenna, was a lot more philosophical in nature, but still involved a bird journeying to find a king. And the other is The Ringdove's Fable, which comes from India and features birds that spoke and offered moral and spiritual lessons. So far as the Conference of the Birds is deeply rooted in Sufism, it would be useful for us to try and understand this mystical framework. Sufism is an esoteric path within Islam, holding that God is the only true existence, whilst the rest of creation is merely an emanation, or a shadow in comparison. The Sufi's goal is to recognize the soul's affinity with God, ultimately leading to the annihilation of the self and union with the divine. Sufi masters are constantly referenced throughout the story, and the bird's journey itself symbolizes self-annihilation in God. However, for Orthodox Muslims, these ideas are often deemed heretical. Mansur al-Hallaj, who I mentioned earlier, was a renowned Sufi figure and became a martyr for his mystical beliefs, and his execution symbolized the risks associated with openly embracing Sufi ideals. Attar himself also faced persecution and was tried for heresy and banished from his hometown, though this was due to another poem rather than the Conference of the Birds. The text itself is a poem that came from Persian manuscripts and likely had its own oral tradition. It was written in the Masnavi meter of Persian narrative poetry, where rhymes occur within each line, typically at the 11th and 22nd syllables. For this presentation, I'll be using Dick Davis's translation, which he rendered in English as heroic couplets. These have rhymes at the end of each line. Whilst impressive, translating the Conference of the Birds comes with a great deal of challenges. Not only the general difficulties of translation, but also capturing the complexity of Attar's metaphorical language. The Persian language itself, or at least its grammar, has imperative and negative imperative forms, which could be quite awkward to express in English too. Attar's work is filled to the brim with poetic devices, including metaphor, hyperbole, anaphora. An example of anaphora might feature 5 lines that start with let go of X, let go of X, let go of Y, or multiple lines that emphasize love, creating an almost obsessive focus to convey the intensity of the theme. The story begins with a gathering of birds, where each bird is named and given a defining characteristic. They talk for a while and realize they have no leader and decide to seek out a king, the Simorgh, whose attributes resemble those of their monotheistic Abrahamic god. The Hudhud, the hoopoe, is introduced as their guide, namely for his status as the companion of Suleiman, who was a prophet of God and therefore had divine knowledge. The hoopoe takes the role of a Sufi sheikh, leading the birds, who represent human desires, doubts and reservations, onto a spiritual journey. Most of the poem consists of the hoopoe responding to the birds' objections with allegorical stories. These stories are not unlike koans from Zen Buddhism. They aren't meant to have any one specific interpretation, but are closely tied to each of the birds' objections. An example of this is as follows. A ragged pilgrim of the Sufi's way by chance met with a king and heard him say, "Who's better, me or you?" the king had said. "Silence, your words are empty as your head. Although self-praise is not our normal rule, the man who loves himself is still a fool. I'll tell you, since I must, that one like me exceeds 1,000 like your majesty. Since you find no delight in faith, alas, yourself has made of you, my lord, an ass, and sat on you, and set its load on you. You're just its slave in everything you do. You wear its halter, follow its commands, and no one left completely in its hands. My study is to reach truth's inmost shrine, and I am not myself's ass, he is mine. Now since the beast I ride on rides on you, that I'm your better is quite plainly true." After giving allegories for every single one of the birds' complaints, the Hudhud finally begins on the journey, explaining that first they must pass through 7 valleys. The first, Valley of the Quest, is where they'll spend most of their time, perhaps even years before they reach their goal. Here the Hudhud gives us the story of Majnun and Layla, where a man named Majnun searches for his beloved Layla by sifting through the sand and the dirt beneath him. Despite knowing she isn't there, he still literally leaves no stone unturned. In the Valley of Love, they must give up everything they own to steal a moment with the friend alone. He gives the example of a king who's in love with a boy that sells wine. So he gives up everything he owns just to spend another second with the boy, until he becomes a beggar and dies. They progress along the valleys until they reach poverty and nothingness, or the essence of fana, the annihilation of the self. And I really like Dick Davis's translation here, where he says, "When sunlight penetrates the atmosphere, 100,000 shadows disappear. When the sea rises, what can save the patterns on the surface of each wave?" This is the Sufi's ultimate aim, to dissolve the self entirely and become one with God. And so the birds arrive at last, though only 30 made it past. A herald of the Simurgh descends, with words that cut and condescend, urging them to turn away, to leave the path they chose to stay. Grief is your fate, your weightless dust, unworthy of the Simurgh's trust. But still they plead, like moths to flame, drawn to a fire they cannot tame. They know they'll burn, but onward press, their only aim to near its breath. At last the gate is opened wide, to a throne of light where truth resides. A page awaits, inscribed and bound, with all they've done and spoken found. Their spirits quake, undone by shame, as light reveals their souls the same. For in that light there's shown the truth. 30 birds, no other proof. The name itself, a clever jest. C means 30, Morgh the rest. The 30 birds had found their way, and they themselves were Simurgh's ray. As Dick Davis writes in the closing verse, then as they listened to the Simurgh's words, a trembling dissolution filled the birds. The substance of their being was undone, and they were lost like shade before the sun. Neither the pilgrims nor their guide remained. The Simurgh ceased to speak, and silence reigned. I hope you enjoyed my attempt at imitating the poetry of the Conference of the Birds. In terms of influence, other than me, Rumi was possibly the greatest and most well-known Persian poet and was notably influenced by Attar. There have been some stage adaptations based off the story as well as numerous musical pieces that have been composed, most notably by Zulfiqar Ali Jr. and Christopher Tin. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation.